This work. Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, here in the UK, I think it's very difficult to disentangle the morass of lies and misinformation that we've heard about the EU and try and come to any kind of conclusion about whether the EU is a good thing or not, whether we should be in favour of it or not. And in any case, I think the polls in this country are completely meaningless. In the past couple of years, it's been impossible to predict what anybody really thinks or how anybody was really going to vote in elections or referendums. So today I want to look beyond the narrow confines of the messy and contradictory conundrum in which we find ourselves in this country, which has been very much fueled by incompetent politicians. And I'm going to look across the channel to the continent and to what other member states think about the EU, based on the results of a recent poll of nearly 10,000 people. This is a poll that was carried out in a number of countries: France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, Spain, Sweden and the UK. Why? Because together these countries represent more than 80% of the EU population. So it's quite a representative sample, if you like. I think the first and most interesting thing to say, in a way, is that following a dip last year, there's been an upswing in the popularity of the EU. And interestingly, there's been an upswing even in the UK after the referendum. So now more people than before think that the EU is a good thing, which again is a little ironic, but there we are. And if we look at some percentages about the percentage of the population that is in favour of the EU, you will see that in many countries the percentages are quite high. In Poland, interestingly, 74% of the population is in favour of the EU. In Hungary, 67%. And I picked out those two countries because of, shall we say, recent friction between the European Commission and Poland and Hungary, leading a Commission representative indeed to say that if Poland were to try to join the EU today, it wouldn't be allowed in. So some of the policies that are being carried out by these two countries conflict with EU principles. But in the countries themselves, the population is still very much in favour of the EU. Similarly high figures in some other countries, for example Germany, 68% of the population in favour of the EU. And one I'd like to pick out because I think this is interesting, Spain, 62%, even with the quite devastating effects of the financial crisis on, for example, youth unemployment. They're still in favour of the EU. In Greece, less so. And the poll also looked at how people felt about economic performance and whether they felt that their economy was doing okay or doing better than last year. It may not surprise you to hear that in Greece, 2% of the population believes that the economy is doing well. It's a very low figure, but there is a surprising number of people in the other member states that do believe that their economy is doing well. In some of the member states, the figures reach into the 60s and 70s. But sticking with Greece, despite the fact that they all think their economy is a disaster, and I need hardly explain why, 34% of the population is nevertheless in favour of the EU. Now, 34%, I don't know if you will take that to be a high figure or a low figure. It depends on your perspective. And contrast that with the number of people who would support leaving the EU in Greece. That figure is at 36%. So it's broadly equal, really. A third of the population is in favour of the EU. A third of the population thinks that the country should leave. the EU. That figure for people who think that the country should leave the EU, should Grexit, is significantly higher than in other member states. In France, for example, the equivalent figure is 22%. In Sweden, 22%. In Spain, just 13% people think there should be a Spexit. In Germany, it's just 11%. And in Poland, here's Poland again, 11%. But, and here's a contradiction that I can't quite get my head around. If you look at the support for a referendum on membership, that support is very much higher. So, for example, in Greece, 58% of the population thinks that there should be a referendum on membership. In France, 61%. In Spain, 65%. So you see the contradiction. Only 13% of Spaniards think that they should leave the EU, but 65% of them think that there should be a referendum on membership of the EU. So in trying to understand this contradiction, I guess this is an expression of the fact that people feel that their voice isn't being heard and that they would like their voice to be heard more within the EU policy process somehow. And that is supported by some of the other information in the poll, to the effect that many people across these member states would like to see some power being basically repatriated from Brussels in certain key areas. And you may not be surprised to hear that those key areas are above all migration. 3/4 of the population across all these member states wanted national governments to be in charge of migration policy, for migration from outside the EU but also from within the EU. And the second area that people felt was very important was trade negotiations. Many people wanted the trade deals to be struck by the national governments and not by the EU acting on behalf of all the member states. So you can see that there is a desire for a transfer of power back from Brussels to the member states. Now, I've gone through all sorts of figures and percentages, and the country I haven't mentioned at all in there is Italy. And I've left it to the end because Italy bucks the trend of this whole poll. So where I said support for the EU is actually rising after a dip, Italy is the only country where there has been a decline in support for the EU in the past year. The figure for people who are favourable to the EU in Italy has dropped to 57%, and they have a less favourable view of the economy than they did in 2016. And I think all of this is a reflection of how Italians feel in particular about the migration crisis. And we know that Italy has had to take in 9/10 of the migrants arriving by sea, and that the Italians are also very disapproving of how the EU has tackled the financial crisis. And in conclusion, I would just say that this rising disquiet in Italy about immigration, and also an increasing anti-Euro sentiment, and there have been some noises about leaving the Euro, about trying to leave certain key sectors of EU policy. All of this is pushing Italian voters perhaps towards politicians who represent quite extreme views. And with elections coming up by May next year, I think the uncertainty about the situation in Italy is something that could be very damaging to the EU as a whole. And if Italy were to take a step back from the EU or the Euro, I think that would rock the foundations of the EU far more than Brexit is likely to do. Thank you.